thank you so much for being here. It's my absolute pleasure to be interviewing Annie Murphy Paul, who has written, among other publications, her recent book, The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside the Brain. And this book has really touched me in so many ways, having been trained as a dancer to discount my physical sensations and to think that they're not intelligent, and then to come up against so much structure that tells me to sit still and to focus on a small machine. And her book has just illuminated that the movement work that I do and the practices that I've had in the last 20 years to begin to listen to my sensations, to validate those qualities of movement and experience is actually extending the mind. So it is my absolute pleasure and honor to welcome Annie Murphy Paul. Join me, everybody, and give her a woohoo! Thank you, Annie.
Thank you, Diana. That is the loveliest introduction I think I've ever had. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So to start us off, we've discussed a couple of times and met, and one of the things that I'm really curious about is that you have many practices and principles that you go over throughout the book, and that you've shared with me that some of those have actually been challenging for you and really changed your orientation to your personal thinking around thinking.
For sure.
And
Yeah.
I just would love for you to share one or two gems that you're actually using or utilizing or having right now.
Sure. So, yeah, I would say that when I started the research and reporting for this book on the extended mind, I was a very brain-bound person. That's a word that the philosopher Andy Clark uses to describe a mode that a lot of us are in, because our culture really encourages us to be, or even enforces this mode on us, which is, and brain-bound means that we imagine that thinking only happens up here in the head, and that if we need to get something done, if we need to solve a problem or come up with an idea, the way to do that is to sit still, be quiet, work that brain until it's exhausted, and that's how you get good work done. And I would say that I very much subscribe to that mode for most of my working life. I've been a freelance writer for many years. I work by myself mostly, and I do a lot of reading and a lot of thinking. And so I really do live inside my head. And it was very easy for me to forget that I have a body, that I didn't really understand at that point before I began work on my book, that the body could contribute to the thinking process. I also wasn't so attuned to the way that the physical environment that I was in could really affect the way I was thinking. And I wasn't so in tune with the fact that that relationships with other people could also be a facet of my thinking process. So in the course of researching and reporting this book, all of those options were open to me by discovering this idea of the extended mind. As I mentioned this philosopher, Andy Clark. I borrowed the idea from him and another philosopher, David Chalmers. So it's not my idea, but with the book, my hope was to kind of operationalize this idea from philosophy and make it very practical and offer ways that people could integrate this idea of the extended mind into their everyday lives. And I ended up following my own advice in the sense that I did adopt a number of the practices that I write about in the book for myself. And I think they actually helped me to write the book. I'm not sure that I could have completed it without all the extended mind practices that I took up during the course of writing the book. So
wow. So while you were writing the book, you actually were incorporating and maybe even as you researched and discovered one principle, then you actually would apply it, and that actually helped you complete the book.
Yeah. So it was really I was implementing the book as I was writing it. And you asked me for a couple of examples. I mean, before I started researching and writing the book, I had never heard of this capacity known as interoception, which is the ability to sense the signals and cues that are arising from within our bodies. We're so focused on all the external stimuli that we're bombarded with at all times, and we don't realize or remember, certainly not encouraged to do so by our culture, that there's a constant flow of internal sensations that is always there if we tune into it. And so I started practicing what is known as a body scan. Some of you listening who have engaged in mindfulness meditation may have encountered it. It encourages you to pay open-minded, non-judgmental, curious attention to whatever internal sensations are arising from your body. Sometimes you focus on one sort of body part at a time, sort of gradually moving across your whole body, paying attention to your breath, to your heartbeat, if you can sense your heartbeat. And interestingly, research has demonstrated that when people regularly practice a body scan, they become more interoceptively attuned. They become more sensitive to their body signals. And so I have incorporated a body scan practice into my everyday life, not in a really formal way, not while sitting on a meditation cushion, but just periodically throughout the day, remembering to sort of rest my attention away from all that, busy external stimuli that's always clamoring for our attention, and tuning in to that internal flow of information and checking in with myself to say, what's going on here now? What am I feeling on the inside? And that has really been an important practice for me in the sense of reconnecting me with my body and not having myself just live in my head all the time.
So what I like about that is that you've actually incorporated into like throughout your day, instead of like, okay, now I have to do a body scan.
Right.
Which is often that comes into my head is like, okay, I have to go lay down and do the thing. So you were able to incorporate that. Was that a process of incorporating, like, did you have a trigger that helped you remember over time? Or how did you incorporate that?
That's interesting. Yeah, I think it became more of a thing that I did when there was a break in my work. And, that can be, now that we have these devices that are feeding us information at all times, it's very easy to shift, to feel like you're taking a break, because you shift from doing your work on your screen to another screen, and you start looking through Twitter or Facebook or whatever. But to the brain, those are very similar activities, and they draw on the same cognitive capacities. They're really depleting those same cognitive capacities. So I start another innovation that I introduced because of the research that I was doing for the book, was thinking about not just directing my attention always, managing the demands on my attention, but also thinking about the supply. Where am I restoring and replenishing my store of attentional abilities? And what I learned from the research that I did for the Extended Mind is that the quickest and easiest and most effective way to restore your attentional capacity, which gets so drained by this very hard-edged focus that we have to engage in when we're working, is to spend time outside. And that was something, especially during the pandemic, that became a real ballast for me, going outside, taking walks. And interestingly, the research suggests that even if you don't have time to go outside, looking out the window, and I have this nice, beautiful oak tree right outside my window, just looking out the window for as little as 40 seconds has some of that attention restoration effect, where your brain doesn't have to focus quite so intently on these little symbols and letters that dominate our work life. Instead, we bring a more diffuse kind of attention when we're looking at things outside. Diana, you and I talked about how scientists call it soft fascination, because it doesn't have that hard edge of the attention that we bring to our work. It's a very diffuse and soft kind of allowing your attention to be diverted here and there. And that's very easy and effortless for your brain to do. And so you return from that time outside, or that time looking out of the window. I do return from that time really feeling restored and refreshed. And I try to do that now, instead of, again, like just turning to a different kind of screen when I have some downtime.
Yeah, that's something that I think that struck me in the book. There's so many things that struck me in the book, but also just distinguishing that we often think that we're taking a break when we're looking at our phone and checking our texts or checking our personal email, maybe,
Hmm.
and that
Hmm.
that is not restorative or generatively restorative.
Hmm.
And I have a beautiful tree outside my window, and as I was digesting your book and integrating it, I was more consciously aware of looking at that as a way to
Mm.
restore instead of just,
Mhm.
oh yeah, there's a nice tree.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
nice tree, but really having that sense of receiving. And also you're talking about nature, and I had this experience yesterday because you were talking in the book, you're talking about how we're more loopy than we think we are, as far, not like
Mhm.
loopy loopy, but as far as how our mind works. We work
Mhm.
in loops, and how
Mhm.
when we think about getting a task done, we think we have to sit down and do the thing and focus, 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 focus,
Right.
which is a lot of cognitive overload happening in that moment.
Mhm. Mhm.
Instead of what I did yesterday, listening to your book and then not listening to it and listening to an interview, I walked on the beach.
Mm.
And at a point, I was listening to your book and you said, having soft fascination.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
really experienced that. I was watching the pelicans and they were taking a bath and they were having a
Mhm.
fabulous time. And I just experienced that sense of soft fascination. Can you say
Mhm.
a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you had that experience, and I'm so jealous that you can go walk on the beach when you need some time outside. Um, yeah, that model we have in our minds, that brain-bound model of if I need to get something done, I need to sit here and work my brain until it's until the problem is solved. That really arises from a metaphor that we all carry around, and we may or may not be aware of this idea that we think of the brain as being like a computer. It's just a really pervasive analogy that gets made and that really sort of infiltrates our thinking about our own brains. And it's not a very effective or a very accurate or a very helpful metaphor, because the brain obviously is different from a computer in so many ways. The brain is a computer is a machine, an information processing machine that, like, it's information in, it works on that information and it spits something out. And we expect our brains to sort of work the same way, like feed the information in, let it churn away and then spit out the answer. But actually, the brain is this quirky, idiosyncratic biological organ that evolved to do very different tasks from the ones that we expect it to do. These days in our knowledge-centric society. And one really important difference between the way a computer works and the way our brains work is this quality of loopiness that you highlighted, Diana. And again, this is a borrowing from the philosopher Andy Clark. He talks about how human beings are intrinsically loopy creatures. And what he means by that is that the way human intelligence works, biological intelligence, as opposed to computer intelligence, artificial intelligence, is that our kind of thinking, our kind of intelligence benefits from being looped out of our heads. When we loop the information and ideas in our heads out of our heads, through our bodies, through our physical surroundings, through our relationships with other people, through our tools and our devices. And when we can create these kind of productive loops, maybe we would um, do so by gesturing. We're speaking about some idea we have, we're gesturing, we're expressing it through our bodies. Maybe we're moving things through space, whether it's post-it notes, or we've built a model of our project and we're moving the elements of it around, and then we loop again through the minds of other people by circulating a draft or even just talking about our ideas. The more of those generative loops that we can create, the more enriched and enhanced our ideas become. Whereas when they stay sealed inside our head, there's no chance for those ideas and that information to get elaborated and enhanced. They just sort of stay inert. So that's one way that our brains are really different from computers. And I think that idea of loopiness really appeals to me. I'm glad that you pulled that out of the book as well.
Yeah, definitely. Because you also talk about cognitive overload, and that's something that I experience when I'm trying to sit and focus and work on documents and answer emails and be very, very focused in there. At a certain point, I get very tired. I'm like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. I just get very
Mhm.
frustrated.
Mhm.
And so there are many practices and principles that you illustrate in your book. Um, and having that sense that this is actually how the mind works, having
Mhm.
these different loops, being able to go through these, through my body, through my sensations, through my relationships, through my surroundings, being in nature, how do I
Mhm.
interact with the space around me,
Mhm.
seems much more holistic
Mhm.
than
Mhm.
this very like, I have to sit and do this thing.
Right. It kind of embraces our fullness as human beings, the fact that we have bodies and the fact that we're embedded in physical spaces and we're networked with all these different people in our lives. It kind of welcomes in all those aspects of what it means to be a human being instead of focusing only on this one slice of, almost like a brain in a vat where the brain is supposed to do all the everything on its own. And really the brain, as we've been saying, it's this quirky, idiosyncratic, limited biological organ that evolved to do things other than what we expect it to do. So it's really not up to the task of doing all the things we expect it to do on its own. We need to augment the capacities of the biological brain, what you might call like the naked brain, the brain all on its own, with these outside the brain resources, which can include, the movements and gestures of our bodies, or natural spaces, interior spaces, and then also, the groups in our lives, the experts and authorities in our life, and then also our peers. So there's all kinds of extra neural resources, meaning outside the brain resources, that can help us think better if we can sort of reframe our thinking to include those things as part of the thinking process.
And that's what's key to me is in reading your book and processing your information is, or even I just said processing your information. So, it's so in the language that we
Hmm.
use, that we say, I'm
Totally.
going to file that away. I'm processing
Right.
that information.
Yeah, it's so
It,
true.
and so how I'm in this process of like challenging myself and what I think
Hmm.
is true, and employing these many different ways. And you say in the book that um, employing more than one at a time often has,
Hmm.
yeah.
Hmm.
So bringing them all in.
Right, right. Which one might do, for example, if one went for a walk with a friend outside. You're really kind of hitting three three targets there, because you're incorporating physical movement into your thinking. You have that social relationship going, and you're in the outdoors. So those kinds of combinations of mental extensions can be really fruitful.
I love saying mental extensions and hearing mental extensions. There's
Hmm.
something about that um, resonates with me of being able to really employ that as an
Hmm.
idea. And I think that helps go against the mind, the brain as computer,
Hmm.
is to have that sense of I'm extending my mind at this level, instead of like, oh, it's not that thing, it's this thing, of just
Hmm.
kind of being more in embracing that I have that capacity naturally. As
Hmm.
a baby, I had these like interoception, that I was able to know. I mean, I would scream when I was hungry or tired or whatever. I was
Hmm. Hmm.
very cued in. And it's over time through education, caregivers,
Hmm.
what, that I've lost that. And so it's like a,
Yeah.
say more.
Yeah, well, the those divisions that get introduced are really the things that are artificial. The idea that the body is separate from the mind, for example, or the idea that we do anything as individuals, and when really we are always we're constituted as social beings. We come into this world as social beings. We're shaped by other people. The idea that anyone achieves something completely on their own, is it's a fiction that's promoted by our culture, but the extended mind helps us, I think, see through some of those artificial divisions. The idea that we're not affected by the place where we are, which would be true of a computer, but in fact, the human brain's very different. We are exquisitely context sensitive, so that we think differently. We think different kinds of thoughts depending on where we are. So then that puts a whole new emphasis on thinking about how do we design the spaces that we're in, where do we choose to spend our time, and are there ways that we can improve the spaces that we're in to allow us to think better. It just opens, to me, the thing I like about the theory of the extended mind is that it opens up so many avenues, it gives us so many options, instead of this very narrow idea of you just sit there and work your brain until the work is done.
Yes, I'm resonating with the artificial barriers. There's something about those two words of seeing it more as something that's not true, and that I'm expanding or extending my mind into what is true. And it's just that what we've been taught in general for most of us here is this very brain bound thinking. That is, go ahead.
Well, I find it so interesting, Diana, that you had a suspicion that was artificial and false in a way because of your dance training, because you knew from your own experience that actually your body is intelligent, that actually you can think with the movements of your body. And something you said to me before we started this conversation on the air was that you felt validated by this book. And that's been some of the most gratifying feedback that I've gotten about the book, is that some people have said, like, I already knew all of what you're saying, or, I kind of had found my way to a lot of what you're saying, but thank you for giving me the scientific validation to believe in what I kind of always knew was true. So I think that's really interesting.
Yes, very validating. And actually, what's interesting is through my traditional dance training, because I have a degree from UCLA in dance, and in that more official training, it was actually more brain bound. It was more like I have to control my body, I have to be in a certain position, mostly. And then there were a few instructors in there that was a little bit more about interoception and sensing. And it wasn't until probably that I injured myself being a dancer, and I moved into massage therapy and explored other types of body work, that I found Karen Roper and her work, Essential Motion, which is all about coming into the interoception and coming out of the mind and into the body, and then expanding that awareness into the group. And we used to do it in person. I'm in a weekly Tuesday group with some of us have been there for 22 years. And there's a sense of expansion and moving into what you talk about, like thinking in groups, of having that sense of connection, of having, and we wouldn't necessarily, we do start with like a warm up, a lead warm up, where we are doing synchronized movement. So please talk a little bit about thinking in groups.
Yeah, I would imagine that would be another synchronized movement would be another feature of the extended mind that dancers would immediately understand.
Yes.
Yeah. So in the last third of the book, I that's about thinking with relationships, and as I mentioned, the structure of that is thinking with experts, thinking with peers, and thinking with groups. So that final chapter about thinking with groups looks at how is it that we achieve something like group mind, where there's an assemblage of people that somehow manages to achieve a kind of collective intelligence or collective consciousness, so that they're more than the sum of their parts, and they're thinking together and using their kind of combined brain power to solve and to address and solve some of the really daunting challenges that we face in this world today, challenges that really are not susceptible to being solved by just one person alone. So we really need to figure out how to achieve this collective intelligence, this kind of group mind. And interestingly, some of the most effective ways to induce that sense of groupiness, which, believe it or not, is a term scientists use to describe this process of going from being an assemblage of individuals to a group, an entity unto itself.
You use the word groupiness. I love it.
Groupiness, yeah,
Yes.
I like that word, groupiness. Some of the most effective ways of creating a sense of groupiness are really visceral, very physical, they really speak to a very primal kind of basic human nature. And one of those techniques, one of those kind of hacks that organizations all over the world and throughout time have used is synchronized movement. So when people move in the same way at the same time together, there's something, transformation comes over the people engaged in that kind of activity, where they feel less like individuals. They feel more like all part of one big kind of group. And we can see this in like dancing, like at raves, for example, or the military, when armies march together and sort of bond together by again moving as one, or even religious rituals. There's synchronized or collective movement, shared movement, that's a part of a lot of rituals and religious practices. And so, I give the example in the book of a daily morning exercise routine that is followed by millions of people in Japan, that they start each day by going through the same set of exercises that every school child in Japan learns and continues to do even as they are adults working in offices. And it's hard to imagine that taking root in American culture, but there are other ways that we can engage in synchronized movement. For example, when two or more people walk together, they naturally fall into a synchronized kind of rhythm. And there's research that suggests that people who are at odds, who are in a state of conflict, actually can cooperate better and see eye to eye, see the other's position more easily once they've taken a walk together. Another sort of synchronized movement is we undertake when we eat together, because we're all kind of making the same motions. It's almost like a mirroring kind of way of creating empathy. And I think it's no accident that people have historically come together around breaking bread together, sharing meals, and part of that might be this kind of synchronized movement where you see your own movements reflected in someone else, and a bond is created that way.
Yeah. So, for me personally, since the lockdown here in America, my role has completely changed. I was formerly a massage therapist, and then I started doing digital delivery of movement online, which is more in alignment with my training is movement, which has been amazing for me to facilitate. And one thing that came out of that, out of a need for switching to more digital delivery, is something that I call the We Are One Dance Party.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, I use work from Karen Ropa, the essential motion work of coming out of your head into your body, being aware of the space and the connection of those around us, gratitude practice, extending ourselves to everything. And then also, I totally lost my train of thought there. So there's what's in my mind right now is physiological arousal, because you talk about that as an important element as far as the group, the examples of the military and the different things of being together. And that's one of the things that in the We Are One Dance Party we experience. We're having physiological arousal for those of us that are joining us. Some folks are just working while others are dancing, so all are welcome. And so there's a physiological arousal. And then also I've incorporated Kelly McGonigal's work of her 5 joy moves, data-driven joy moves, which are bouncing, swaying, keeping the beat. And I'll do one song where we're all together, and I'll have a little sign, I'll say bounce, and we're all bouncing together, and the sway, and we're all swaying together. And I before reading your book and really digesting it, I thought of the We Are One Dance Party more as like a fun way to come together and celebrate, and also have some of that. I didn't have the term extended mind, but I now have that sense of how to, and I don't know if this is a weird question, but how to bank on that as far as that is actually engaging the group mind. It's a celebration, yes, and it's fun and it's great, but there's also mind extension happening. There's groupiness happening, which I'm like, oh. And
Well,
anything.
it sounds to me like you're really creating a sense of belonging with those, with your dance parties. And um, I'm wondering, as you describe the shift in the work that you do, Diana, if you feel like it's been a challenge to create those kinds of connections online, or whether you found ways to kind of get people out of their heads and into their bodies, even though you're not physically present with them.
And I'm just going to correct you. I pronounce my name Diana. My dad is listening and he's going to be like, she's saying your name wrong. So,
Diana,
Dad, that's for
Diana.
you, Diana.
Hi, hi there, Diana's dad. Mm,
um, so what comes to mind is that I do the party at 8 o'clock in the morning, and that's so for folks from EMEA, mostly Europe, and the
mm, mm,
Americas can come. And I for about 6 months, uh, that was the dominant. Was There's folks from Hamburg and Switzerland, and they were coming in the Americas, and I had this, they were coming regularly. And there was maybe five of that. Well, actually, there was about eight from that group that I just almost instantaneously felt this sense of connection. And
mm,
they're in Europe. And
mm,
so
mm,
I just, they would come and we were smiling. And there was definitely a bond that I
mm,
still
mm,
feel the time doesn't work for them as well. Things have
mhm,
shifted with as
mhm,
far as lockdown, opening the office. Um, I have this sense of connection with them when I think of them. I'm like, oh
mm,
yes,
mm,
and the
mm,
lightness comes to me.
mm,
So I have been able to extend my mind through the camera, through the
mhm,
digital,
mhm,
through movement, especially
mhm,
of having this sense of connection and giving and receiving that
mhm.
I don't know if everyone is able to do, but somehow I have had that experience with those folks in particular that have
Yeah.
regularly.
I wonder if, given that we don't have, many of us who are still working remotely don't have that in-person connection, if the work that you do with the body is even more important. The fact that you're moving, you're gesturing, you're encouraging people to be physical and to get into that state of physical arousal, if that makes some of the connection that you feel possible, rather than just being a head in a box, like so many of us are on Zoom day to day.
Yeah, I mean, given supported by your work, I feel very validated, as I said at the top, by your work. And I do think, and I would love to hear more of what you think about that. I
Mm.
do think, because I get my physical arousal. I'm jumping, I'm sweating,
Mhm,
I'm
mhm,
moving, I'm smiling, I'm encouraging, I'm
mhm.
getting folks to get up, to move their bodies. Um, I would say that it seems more important.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you have any
Well, and
more?
one thing I like about your dance party is that, something I stress in the book is that in our Western culture, there's this divide between mind and body, and that manifests itself in so many ways. But one of them is that we separate what we think of as serious work, intellectual work, from moving the body, so that we might work all day sitting in our chair at our offices, but then go for a workout after work, or on the weekends. We separate them in time and place. Whereas this dance party is doing exactly what I recommend doing in the book, which is bringing physical movement into your workday, into the flow of your kind of daily activities, uh, and thereby sort of bringing mind and body back together. Because again, that separation was always artificial. That was always false, and now we're kind of putting the pieces back together. That were disassembled. I think as part of, it's a long tradition in Western culture, starting with Descartes or maybe before, but then I think the cognitive revolution in the middle of the last century really promoted this idea of brain as computer, and we're just now kind of remembering that there's a lot more to the human, to us as human beings than brains.
Yes, and that brings to mind something that I've been thinking about in relation to your book is this notion of work-life balance, which is talked about a lot.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
versus what I've been thinking is more like work-life harmony.
Hmm.
Because often with work-life balance, or at least how I understand how it's promoted, is that, I work for a certain period of time and then I play for a certain period of time.
Hmm.
And I need to make sure that the play and the work are balanced.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I don't really think that that's possible, that balance
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
really possible, and that it's more of a harmony, like you
Hmm.
were talking before, of being able to be working on a project or whatever it
Hmm.
is, focusing on a computer, let's say,
Hmm.
and then being able to, oh, wow, I'm feeling a little drained. I'm feeling, oh, okay, well, all right, I'm going to look out the window at the
Hmm.
tree
Hmm.
and get a little rejuvenation. Oh, okay. And then I'm able to know, oh, how's my body doing? Okay, maybe I need to do a little stretching and moving.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then moving on to going back to the task and seeing how that helps. And maybe, that's not enough. Maybe I need to go for a 10-minute walk.
Hmm.
And then
Hmm.
actually those breaks are engaging my extended mind. So they're not
Hmm.
really a break at all. And
Hmm.
having this sense that that instead of balancing my work with my play, is that my work is my play and my play
Hmm.
is my work, that I'm
Hmm.
able to rejuvenate and restore and engage the loopiness, engage the groupiness,
Hmm.
and have that more holistic sense of harmony
Hmm. Hmm.
versus balance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, because balance really implies two separate things that we're trying to keep in balance, and that is hard to do. So maybe more of a process of integration is what we want to be thinking about. One place where that might happen is, in the chapters on thinking with relationships, I talk about how another division that our culture makes is between social life and mental or intellectual life, as if they're separate. And again, we kind of treat them as separate, like we might work by ourselves all day and then go to a happy hour after work, but there are so many benefits to bringing social interaction and social practices into our thinking, and I talk in the book about how we have these really incredibly powerful social brains as human beings. Our brains are as big as they are in part to deal with they evolved to be that big and that powerful in order to deal with the complexities of social relationships. And we're social all the time, not just at happy hour, not just like at lunch hour or whatever. So the more we can harness and leverage social practices in the service of thinking well, thinking intelligently, the better. And I think we can do that by bringing in social activities like storytelling and debating and arguing with each other and teaching each other, peer to peer kind of teaching. These are all social activities that activate all these cognitive processes that remain dormant if we just are kind of trying to do our work by ourselves and separate our social brains from our, work brains, which really, as you're saying, doesn't really work.
Remain dormant. I'm kind of curious about that. Would you use that term also as far as the other extending our mind into our sensations, our movement? Would you say,
Yeah, I think we have a lot of powers as human beings that are our birthright as human beings that don't get used, that effectively get wasted if we don't employ them as extensions. And one example I'm thinking of is we tend to celebrate doing things in our heads. We think it's okay for kindergartners to play with objects and rods and blocks and things, but as we get older, we should put those away. And real thinkers, adult, mature thinkers, they do things in their heads. When actually, the more we can get ideas and information out of our heads and onto physical space in some fashion or other, the better we can work with those ideas and pieces of information. Um, and I'm thinking about how when we're able to spread out our ideas and the information that's in our heads onto physical space, say onto a big whiteboard or bulletin board, and all of a sudden we relate to it in a different way, and we can use these embodied resources like our spatial memory, for example. Human beings have really strong spatial memory, so they remember where they put things. They can move things around. They can treat the the information that's in front of them as if it's like a three-dimensional landscape. And when we do that, we engage all these abilities that that again are our birthright as human beings. This ability to move around and to remember where things are, and those are all resources that get wasted when we keep all that information inside our heads.
Yes. Yes. It's the being Homo sapiens, human beings. It is our birthright, and
Hmm.
it is not only our birthright. It's essential. When I think about the complex problems that we have as a species on this planet,
Mm.
with climate change and war and political leaders not getting along, that it's like essential to break down those artificial barriers in
Hmm.
order to really not survive,
Hmm.
let alone
Hmm.
thrive in
Hmm.
our on our planet, with our planet, in harmony
Hmm.
with our planet.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's the piece that I'm like wanting to shout from the top of the well, let's go for trees and just be like,
Hmm.
we have to extend our minds now. Having that being employing all the different avenues that are available for us and taking off the artificial barriers.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah.
I like that. I really like your enthusiasm, Diana.
Yay! So we're getting close to time for quite Q&A. If anybody has any Q&A, please put it in the chat. And I know we had talked briefly about you leading us in a little
Hmm.
experience. Did you still want to do that? Or
Yeah, yeah. I thought for those of you who are listening, I wanted to lead us through kind of three questions that we can ask ourselves, and as a starting point to applying the ideas of the extended mind to our own lives. So the first one is about thinking with the body, and I want everyone who wants to, and for some may not be comfortable with this, and that's fine, because many of us do find it to be a safe space to be up in our heads, and I definitely identify with that. But if you can take just a moment to take a deep breath and tune out all of that busy stimuli that's clamoring for your attention, for your vision and your hearing and smell and all these sensations that we're bombarded with from the outside all the time, and instead tune into what's happening on the inside. And I think you'll find that there is this sort of flow of sensations. They're quieter and they're more subtle than the ones that are grabbing our attention on the outside, but they are there and they're always there. So I think if we could just take 30 seconds to kind of tune in to those internal sensations within a spirit of open-minded, non-judgmental curiosity. Let's try that for 30 seconds. You can close your eyes if you want. I'm going to do that just to kind of shut out the world for a moment. Okay, so coming back, I'll just give a brief report on what I felt. And Diana, if you feel comfortable, you could do the same. I was surprised by some of the muscle tension that I didn't realize was there. Like my jaw was really kind of tense. And I was aware of my breathing and to some extent my heartbeat, which is, it's so funny to think about the fact that that goes on all the time. And yet we're completely unaware of it until we make this intentional choice to tune into those bodily processes that are going on all the time. And I felt my feet sort of pressing against the floor and my back against the wall here, and was thinking about how I'm being supported, as I sit here. Again, just literally remembering that we have a body is can be kind of like a radical thing, because we're encouraged to kind of live in that mental space all the time. Diana, what was that like for you to look inward for a moment?
I sway to kind of help me stay in my body. And so I was more aware of the weight transfer from one foot to another.
Mhm.
I was also more aware that there's birds. I was hearing some
Mhm.
birds. So I was
Mhm.
receiving the sounds of the birds. And yeah, I'm mostly aware of the feed and the transfer.
Mhm. Mhm.
But I was
Mhm.
really, and I hadn't,
Mm.
I've been swaying this whole time, but I haven't been as aware of that transfer of weight until I dropped in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if I don't know if you usually every time I think I've seen you online, you've been standing, and I think there's something about standing where it's much easier to forget about your body when you're sitting. When you're standing, you often are shifting or moving a little bit, and I wonder if that kind of keeps you in tune with your body that you're not seated.
It's an interesting dynamic that I've been playing with is the standing versus the sitting.
Mhm.
I find that when I stand, it's kind of necessary to move because I invariably end up kind of like this, like all
Mhm.
twisted, and my
Mhm.
head is in my
Mhm.
hand when I'm standing. And so it's a little bit more, especially in meetings,
Mm.
a little more challenging because my body wants to move.
Mhm. Mhm.
So swaying helps me to not be in these weird
Mhm.
positions.
Mhm.
So
Hmm.
I guess the good news is that I become aware of how I do that. I'm like, "Oh,
Mhm.
okay, let's shift that and then maybe move around a
Mhm.
little bit." So I do think it does encourage more movement.
Mhm.
However, sometimes my body wants to sit. My body's tired.
Mhm.
My body's like,
Mhm.
"Can we sit for a little?" And so when I sit,
Mhm.
I'm also I'm very aware of sitting on my sits bones
Mhm.
but invariably I may end up in some weird position. And
Mhm.
then so it
Mhm.
seems like if I'm standing, then I have more available to move, right? If
Mhm.
I'm sitting, then I have to stand up.
Mhm.
Or if I'm already standing, then I have more available to move. So I do think
Mhm.
that standing helps me.
Mhm. Mhm.
It
Hmm.
helps me be more present as well, I think.
Mhm. Maybe more alert.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, to move on to the second question, which is about the physical space, our environments in which we're working. And I want everybody who's listening to kind of look around. I imagine you're in your home office, but maybe not. Maybe you're in some other space where you've chosen to be during this workday. And look around for, in particular, what researchers call evocative objects. And these are cues and signs and symbols, objects of various kinds that do two kinds of work. Because evocative objects can be uh, cues of identity. In other words, things that remind you of who you are as an individual, and then cues of belonging, things that remind you that you belong to valued groups. So I'll just do a scan of my room right here, and I see a statuette of a Buddha, which is kind of both because I think of my individual identity is connected to being Buddhist, and also it also connects me to a worldwide community of people who follow Buddhist practice. I see some books over there, one of which is my book and a couple different translation. So that's like an affirmation of me as a writer, kind of cue of identity. And I see some photographs of my kids. So those are cues of identity of myself as a mom, and also cues of belonging that I belong to my family. So I don't know if you want to look around a little bit where you are, Diana, and tell us. Do you see any
Well, the
evocative
thing is
objects?
I'm cat sitting, so
Oh,
this is
this is not
not
your
my
place.
environment, but there
Uh-huh.
are definitely lots of things that are mine.
Mm.
Um, and I think that, well, what's interesting is that she has a very small foam roller. And I
Mhm.
used to teach self massage techniques with foam rollers. So there's something
Mhm.
identify with the foam, even though it's not my foam
Mhm.
roller.
Mhm.
I identify with that foam roller as something that I use that is helpful as a tool for myself.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then the cup that I've been using for tea since I've gotten here, I've been here for a couple of weeks. There's something about that that is
Mhm.
cueing something because that
Mhm.
it's a ritual, right? I'm using that one
Mhm.
cup every day for my
Mhm.
tea. Uh,
Mhm.
So yeah, that's mostly, there's not a lot else that's me
Hmm.
in the room.
Hmm. It's probably especially important in this new setting that you have a few things that do remind you of you and connect you to who you are.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a
Mm-hmm.
really good point. And actually, this tapestry is mine. It's not
Hmm.
hers. So
Hmm.
that's something that also is helping me. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
was a
I think
gift
that's
from
one reason.
someone. Yeah.
I was just going to say that's one reason that travel can be so discombobulating. I mean, travel is wonderful and stimulating and exciting, but I find it often really exhausting,
Me
especially
too.
when I'm in a different country and part of it is that everything that we're seeing around us it doesn't have those familiar associations. We don't identify with what we're seeing. So it's very, and the converse of that, the flip side of that is that when we have those objects that support our identity and our sense of belonging around us, that's a very it creates a very supportive atmosphere for doing your best work and your best thinking.
I think that actually supports why I overpack, but not that I want to continue to overpack,
You want
but
to
it
bring your
definitely.
evocative objects with
Yes,
you.
I do. I do bring
Mm.
I do bring, I mean, actually the other thing that I have is this little brain. I don't know if
Mm.
it's a little squishy brain. It's my
Mhm.
fidget brain. And I found that on a walk, and that actually, that is, I identify with this as well, is
Mhm. Mhm.
finding objects
Mhm.
that I love, that I can fidget with and squish, and that it's a
Mhm.
brain.
It's a ring. Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect. Well, I'll just do the last question because I see a few
And we do
questions
have,
here
yeah,
in
we
the
do have a
chat.
couple questions. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just mention, just to go into this third realm of asking everybody to think for a moment, reflect for a moment about who you think with, which relationships extend your thinking. And for me, a number of people come to mind immediately. One is a writers group that I've been a part of for many years. And I know that being friends with these and colleagues with these writers has extended my own thinking about writing, about the industry that I'm in ways that I could never have done by myself. And I think there's a lot of groupiness in our group. And then I think about some editors and mentors that I've had and how they have extended my mind in ways that are really valuable. And then finally, I teach sometimes, and I find that my students extend my mind. Certainly, the practice and the effort of teaching is itself really mind extending for me. So those are all types of relationships that really bring me out of my own isolated individual head and help me think with other people. So I don't know if Diana, if you have
Oh, I'll just mention
someone
a
you
couple
can
because I
think
want to
of
get
that
to the
way.
questions. Is
Yeah.
that my Tuesday Essential Motion group that I've been in for about 22 years, with some folks that have been there that whole time. That brings me, I mean, we are doing actually the groupiness practices that you outline in the book without knowing
Mhm.
it. And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
that is a place
Mhm.
of restoration and mind extension that I experience every week. Also facilitating, teaching, learning from my students, having that interaction, even like the chatting before the class, I find
Mhm.
very,
Mhm.
that community and that sense of mind extension that
Mhm.
we're in together. So
Mhm.
those are a couple.
That's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
That's great.
I really appreciate highlighting those because I hadn't thought about that.
Mhm.
And I recommend for all the audiences that are here of to do that practice of um, being more in tune with your body, being more in tune with your environment and how it supports you, and then also the groups that you have in your lives.
Mhm. Mhm.
All of that is mind extension.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so we have oh, and I'm supposed to highlight this and put it in the private chat. We have a question from Adam Stoves. A break most of us hopefully have every day, which is differently restorative from person to person and even from night to night, is sleep. Sorry.
Mhm.
Insights on sleep helping us better think outside the brain. Anything you have to say about sleep being
That's
restorative?
that's a super interesting point, Adam. I have to say I haven't really thought about sleep as a mental extension, but of course we all know how much better we think and how much clearer our minds are when we've slept well. So it certainly seems that sleep could be a kind of mental extension. One thing that it brings to mind for me is this idea that I write about in the extended mind, um, called extension inequality, because once we start thinking of intelligence not as some fixed lump of stuff that's sealed inside each person's head, like bigger or smaller, the way that we tend to measure intelligence with our IQ tests and all the rest. But when we instead take an extended mind perspective and we start thinking of intelligent thought as something that we kind of assemble in the moment from the raw materials that are available or not available in our environment, that's a whole different way of looking at what makes people smart, what makes people not so able to engage in intelligent thinking. And so that really just brings up for me the fact, and this is what I mean when I talk about extension inequality, that we don't have anything like equitable distribution of the raw materials of intelligent thought. Some people have access to beautiful green spaces and some people don't. Some people have freedom to move their bodies around and some people don't. And I think sleep is increasingly becoming a social justice issue. And some people have quiet, safe places to sleep and other people don't. So to me, that sleep would be a place to look at, just another avenue into this question of how do we ensure that everybody has the raw materials to assemble intelligent thought with. And sleep is one of those areas where we could do a much better job as a society of making sure that everyone has access to that very important constituent of intelligent thought.
Yes, that opens up a whole slew of conversation that we don't have time for of inequality and safety and sleep. And thank you for bringing it up. Yeah. Let's go to Aaron's question. Annie is extending our minds, bringing ideas out of our heads and into our spaces. Do you recommend any ways to do this? I think of Legos, whiteboards, chalkboards, and you do discuss this in your book.
Yeah. This has been probably one of the, thank you for that question, Aaron. One of the most transformative aspects of the extended mind for me is that I now regularly kind of try to get my ideas and the pieces of information in my head out of my head and onto physical space. For me, I love Post-it notes because I love the fact that they are manipulable objects that you can move around. And, if I'm organizing a chapter or organizing an article, it's so helpful for me to sort of do almost like a mental dump dump everything out onto physical space and then move things around. And it's just, we were able to relate, as I was saying, very differently to information and ideas when they're outside of our head than when they're inside of our head. And there's a particular phrase I often think of that was, I came across in the research, known as the detachment gain, it's like the benefit that you get from taking stuff out of your head and putting it onto space. You put a little distance between yourself and your ideas. It's kind of like when you're writing something and you feel the need to print it out. Like, why is it different to have it printed out on paper and be able to mark it up? But somehow it is. That's the kind of loopiness that we were talking about earlier, like creating those loops, because that's how biological human intelligence works. But to Aaron's specific question, I think Legos, whiteboards, chalkboards are all great options. Also, things like three-dimensional models. Architects and designers often employ three-dimensional models, which you can then move around, manipulate. You can move your own body around it and thereby change your perspective on how it looks from this angle and that angle. Anything that turns ideas and pieces of information into physical objects that we can manipulate. That's really what our brains evolved to do, and not to sort of process abstract information. So the more we can turn it into concrete, tangible objects that we can manipulate, the better we'll be able to do our thinking with those objects.
Yes, and one of those things about that is of the models and the whiteboards and is for me as is bringing my body involved. So my physicality is now being involved. Not only am I offloading it onto a piece of paper or a post-it or a whiteboard. I'm also engaging my body as my whiteboard's over here and I'm doing this stuff over here. Or I have a model and I'm engaging with that model. So again, bringing in more of the mind extensions that are available, more than one at a time.
Right.
So also I'm imagining being able to come into my body and be a little bit more into my interoception or noticing the sensations of my body as have my Post-its and my whiteboard and my
Oh, I love that. Yep. Being
Yeah.
aware of your body as you're moving it and relating it to the information or the ideas in front of you.
Yeah. So we're about at the end of our time, Annie. Is there anything that you would like to express or say as a kind of conclusion or anything?
I'll just say again that my very favorite thing about the extended mind is that it gives us so many opportunities and options and choices, and those are all rooted in our nature as human beings and our fullness as human beings. And so to me, the theory of the extended mind is such a gift because it kind of returns us to ourselves as humans. It tells us, no, you're not just this narrow slice of cerebral activity. You're a body. You're in space, in physical space. You're a social being connected to other people. You're a tool user. All these things that are really the essence of our humanity and can become we can return them to the core of our thinking process as long as we open our mind to it and don't allow ourselves to be constrained by the false divisions and distinctions of our culture.
Yes, I'm really hopeful that that we're able to bring this important work of our human essence and take away the artificial barriers that we've been discussing so that we can actually utilize what's available that we've been actually cutting ourselves off from.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Annie Murphy-Paul, it's been my absolute pleasure and honor, and I am just so thrilled that you are here with me today and sharing your information. Thank you so much, and thank you
Diana.
everybody who's been in the audience. Thank you, Annie.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. I really have enjoyed talking with you, Diana.
Yes, it's been lovely. Thank you, and thanks everybody. Cheers.